One thing that News Corp isn't reporting on so much, and this will make a nice little segue to our international segment today, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which WikiLeaks released some information on earlier in the week. Before I go on to give some background information, boys, you are familiar with the TPP and what Julian Assange has been releasing about it?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I'm not familiar what he's been releasing about it. I'm familiar with it from way back. It goes back to Keating. They were trying to implement this for probably decades now.
Well, it's of critical importance to Australia, but also to the other 11 nations who are involved. So this is really an international and domestic thing, and I wanted to spend probably 15 minutes today talking about it. As we speak right now, there is a meeting going on between the lead negotiators of the 12 countries in Canberra today, the 19th of October 2014. That's happening right now. And then the ministers get together later next week in Sydney, and it's quite possible that they're all going to agree to this TPP by the end of next week. It might take longer. It could have been passed months ago, but there's a good chance that in the coming days or weeks, this will be passed. So today we're going to spend a bit of time giving a background on it and then discussing what we think of it. Now, I'll go through the 8 important facts about the TPP that we should all make ourselves aware of. And I've taken these facts from bewarethetpp.com, and I'll link to them in our description box under the video. But I'll go through these things point by point. As I just said, the deal could be signed by the 12 countries involved any day now. And as I said, there is that meeting taking place in Canberra as we speak. Point 2, only 1 in 10 voters have even heard of the TPP because the mainstream media has failed to inform the public. So I found a poll that had been conducted, I think it might have been through Crikey, an essential poll or something like this. It found that only 1 in 10 voters knew anything about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Point 3, it's being negotiated in complete secrecy. So even though the draft texts, some chapters have been released by WikiLeaks, who of course are demonised by the mainstream media, other than that, we don't know anything about it. It's all a secret until it's signed. Point 4, the released texts reveal that the US is pushing for all parties to agree to be bound by what we call ISDS clauses, Investor State Dispute Settlements. And this basically allows foreign companies to not only challenge Australian legislation in transnational forums, rather than Australian courts of law, but to sue our government where it is seen to have enacted legislation that impedes on those companies making profits. And you might recall that when they tried to bring in the plain packaging laws here in Australia, there was talk about the government being sued. That would have been done by Philip Morris, I think it was, in Hong Kong, because our free trade agreement with Hong Kong has this ISDS clause. But that's the only country, one of the few countries we have it with. If this happens with the TPP, the major corporations from the major countries will be able to sue our government. Not in Australian courts, in foreign courts. Point 5, the TPP could harm our pharmaceutical benefit scheme. And for our listeners at home, the PBS, the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, we have subsidised medications here in Australia, and the medications that are subsidised are on a list that the government provides, and then you get the medications cheaper if they're on the PBS. During negotiations on the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement in 2004, US representatives, under heavy lobbying from large American pharmaceutical conglomerates, pushed to allow companies to extend the life of drug patents for new uses, which effectively allows companies to have perpetual exclusive rights to drugs. And this is a practice known as evergreening. So what they do is, suppose you're a pharmaceutical company, you put R&D into developing a drug. The logic is you should get 10 or 15 years of exclusive rights to that drug. And that way you can make your profit back. Once that expires, the same drug can be made generically, and that generic drug will go on the PBS, right? Evergreening means that you can patent your drug, and instead of just getting the 10 or 15 years patent period, at the end of the 15 years, you patent it again for a different purpose. So maybe you originally use it to treat this particular ailment that someone might have, and that'll still be its primary use. But then after 14, you just say, it can also be used to treat this other thing. And so you can just perpetually patent it so the generic drugs can't come on the market, which completely undermines things like the PBS. Under the aforementioned ISDS provisions within NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that was signed in the mid-90s, I think, a large pharmaceutical company attempted to sue the Canadian government to the tune of $100 million for not granting it a patent on a particular drug, claiming that this was an expropriation of intellectual property rights. And that could, again, happen here. Point 6, the TPP could subvert laws which protect the Australian environment. Under ISDS provisions within the NAFTA, a large resource company sued the Canadian government for $250 million as a result of Quebec's moratorium against fracking. So Quebec said, we don't want people pumping chemicals underground to extract oil or gas here. We're not going to allow it. So this company said, that's cool, you signed NAFTA, we'll see you in international court. We have more say than you do now. That's actually how these things work. Point number 7, the TPP could compel governments to legislate draconian laws regarding the internet. And the leaked chapters that we got, courtesy of Julian Assange's WikiLeaks, showed that Australia voted with the US to force internet service providers to block access to repeat offenders of copyright violations. We were one of only 2 countries that sided with the US to do this. In other words, if Lindsay decides he wants to research this show Breaking Bad, now that he's read the article about Hi Hitler, you want to download Breaking Bad and you do so illegally, once upon a time that would just be considered a civil problem at best. The company who produced Breaking Bad might be able to sue you in a court at best. They want to make it a crime, an actual crime, and force ISPs to shut your internet down for downloading movies, for harming nobody. I mean, we can have debates, and hopefully we'll have a debate about copyright laws and whether downloading is theft or any of that nonsense. But ultimately, we're talking about shutting down people's internet and taking them to a criminal court for downloading shows. And Australia and the US were the only 2 countries who voted for this. Point 8. Both of our major parties in Australia, Labor and Liberal, have indicated support for the TPP. Game, set and match, neither of them are going to go against it. So whatever does get agreed to will be agreed to. They have the numbers. Obviously, the government has the numbers in the lower house. Between the 2 of them, they have the numbers in the upper house. They agree to it, and it happens. Now, I do know that the viewers have had to listen to me a lot today. I apologise for that, but it's important that we get these 8 important facts about the TPP on the table. Every single thing that I just said, you can verify yourself with the links. This isn't conspiracy theory, or this isn't exaggeration or hyperbole. This is actually what's being discussed as we sit here right now. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I don't know enough about this personally. I just know that something very similar to this was being floated a number of years ago anyway. And basically they were saying that a foreign company could come into Australia for contracts. So you had to open all your contracts to foreign companies. They could then come into Australia and they could bring their own workers in, and we just lose complete control. Now, I don't know whether that's been incorporated in this or whether that was just something they were floating at the time, but I remember thinking that this is just totally against the Australian people. And I'm amazed that the Labor Party would go in with this if they're claiming to be supporting the unions. But anyway, that's... I don't know whether... What I'm just saying now, whether that's been brought into it or not, I don't know. But I remember at the time they were floating that they were going to do that. So you just lose complete control of your sovereignty as a nation.
Yeah, and the worst part is it's completely secretive. It's in complete secret, and there's no way that the public can get any debate on it, and the public can voice their opinion to it. This is the most concerning thing, and obviously it's quite evident how corporations influence the entire world through the political systems and through big pharma and through a lot of outlets, media, etc., etc. More power for corporations, to sue governments. Are you kidding me? You know what I mean? And every activist out there that knows about this, no matter where you're from, no matter whether you're a right or a left activist, this affects the environment. It affects the pharmaceutical industry. It affects our internet, our privacy. It affects everything. It essentially allows governments to be in just complete control. And everyone should be protesting this, Johnno.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is terrible. I would almost put it in opposite terms to you. What it does is take away our national sovereignty. It almost takes away government control to the point where these corporations become more powerful over our lives. They can use our legal system and our police, but it's essentially corporations with their tentacles all over the world that will have more say over us than our governments. I mean, if to take Quebec as one example, that French-speaking little region of Canada, if they decide as a group of people, we don't want fracking, we're happy as a group to forego any profits that might come because we prefer our environment or we prefer our water or whatever, most people who believe in democracy would say, well, they should have that right. Especially if they vote that way, that should be their right. What happens here is you don't really have a Quebec anymore as far as the law is concerned. It doesn't matter anymore what you guys say. Your sovereignty has been handed over to foreign corporations. And if you try to use your Quebecan government or your regional government against the corporations, that's fine. They will take your regional government to court. They'll take your national government to court. And it won't be a court of law in your nation. It'll be in a third nation, a third party. And it won't be like a court of law where you sit down and you've got a judge, or maybe you've got a jury and two people present their sides and all of that. It's not like that at all. From what I've read of these ISDS provisions, these investor-state dispute settlement courts aren't really like courts at all. It's more of a mediation session. And so I mean, it is so. When I first read about this, I thought this seems too. It seems too crazy.
Couldn't possibly.
Because you hear people talk about the New World Order and how we're not going to have any rights anymore as people, and you hear about all of this and you think, well, that doesn't really seem plausible. But when you look at the consequences of this, that's not just plausible. That's exactly what's going to happen, and it is being negotiated. Just 800 k's to our south, down there in Canberra, as we speak.
Right now,
as we speak.
And I didn't hear about it.
That's why. I mean, we've spent some time today attacking Uncle Rupert, and hoping every podcast that we do, we attack at least one of his articles. But at the end of the day, even if they're printing nonsense in their papers, it's not so much just they're lying or making up things about history that's bad. That's bad enough. But they're not even reporting the most important thing.
Yeah, that's right. They could be using that space they put Hitler as a meth user. They could be telling us about the TPP and actually doing their job as journalists. Journalists, do your job. Do your job and tell the people what is going on, what's really going on.
Well, you've worked in the media, obviously, a lot more than I have, Ethan. Do you really think the journalists at News Corp at Fairfax actually get to decide what gets printed?
From personal experience, the program that one of the programs I was working with in 2012 was about the community of Brisbane, to see what's going on, to document a cultural history of Queensland for the State Library, and asking university students what was important to them and everything. Anything that questioned any authority, etc., was thrown back by the editor, saying that we can't do it when you'd have to pitch your ideas for the weekly news because of partnerships, because of etc. One story I tried to do was the outrage of public transport prices and the hand that the Queensland government has in that, and how it's all being manipulated to be that way, and it doesn't have to be that way. No, you can't run that article because this program is funded by the Queensland State Library, and we can't speak out against them. So going off of that, and with that program working with the Courier Mail, it's obvious either these journalists just shut up and do the articles falsely, as we've talked about last week with Udo Ufkost's his Russia Today interview talking about CI assets. I think it's clear that these journalists are either just shutting up and doing it, or they don't want to speak out because they're going to lose their job eventually. If you're the critical thinker journalist in it, you're going to lose your job. And the only people that are real journalists in these companies are some of the veteran intelligence reporters and some of these independent sort of ones, but their articles get pushed back behind Kim Kardashian's new fashion line or Kim Kardashian at the beach. It's all buried beneath that. Yep. So how do you win?
And you know what people will say to you, some people who think they're smart but prove they're not with their line of thinking, they'll say to you, okay then, if they are doing this, if they're printing Kardashian stories, they're trying to make money, obviously that's what the people want. Obviously the people don't want TPP stories. And I can see why that line of thinking might be appealing until you consider this. That same poll that I talked about saying that 1 in 10 Australians know about the TPP and 90% have no idea. The same poll also asked if, given that the TPP involves this issue, do you think it's something that you should get a vote on before it's passed through Parliament? And then on that question, 90% of people said yes. So clearly, once people have any idea of what this entails, clearly they do care. The problem is they're not being told about it.
Yeah.
I'll go further. There's a massive amount of votes to be won on this issue. Any party who could get out to the masses that there's this thing that's going to hurt their environment, going to hurt their pharmaceutical benefit scheme, going to hurt the internet, to name just 3 things that are important to most people. If there were a party who did run on this platform, I put to you that there's an enormous amount of votes there to be won, especially for a minor party, but even for one of the major parties if they decide to break ranks. So then you have to think through. You always think 2 steps through. Why aren't they campaigning on this? I mean, they can use YouTube, and there are independent news sources that get listeners. They could post to Reddit. There's a number of ways that they could get the message out, even if the mainstream media wouldn't report on this. So why don't any of our major parties, or the so-called minor parties like PUP and Green, why do none of them campaign on this issue if there's so much support for people getting a say on this before it's passed?
And I think that's a testament to the argument about government being completely controlled.
Absolutely.
Because this, if any legitimate government was in power and there was a proposal to sue governments if corporations were going to, influence their tentacles throughout the world, you'd think that any government would say, no, we're in control of this country. We're not going to let international corporations, offshore corporations, run rampant and do what they want in our country. So I think that's a testament again to the control that is just influenced throughout all facets of life.
I noticed some time ago that nearly every Prime Minister, within the first week or two of taking office, seemed to have to make a trip to New York.
Yep.
And I don't know why. I've got a good suspicion why. and that might answer your questions.
Well, we discussed on episode 1 of the Australian Roundtable podcast, which unfortunately you weren't here for, that is a pilgrimage that all leaders, not just the new Prime Ministers, but leaders of Labor or Liberal have to make to New York to meet old Uncle Rupert without fail. Of course, when Kevin Rudd did it in the prior to the 2007 election, it was later leaked that he went to Scores Bar in New York and supposedly touched up strippers or something. And of course, in proper Australian fashion, a leak that was supposed to make him look worse, his polling went up because he was such a stale character that people seemed to like him more when they found out.
Shades of Berlusconi or somebody.
Yeah, exactly. So it happens for both the major parties. You have to go and meet Uncle Rupert. It's even bigger than that, though, because with the Greens, you would think that this is exactly the kind of issue that's right up their alley. Yeah. The environment. A lot of people vote Greens because essentially they just believe in statism and big taxing and big spending. Okay. There's a lot of people who join the Greens because they believe in the environment, protecting the environment. Well, what better way to protect the environment than to maintain national sovereignty and stop foreign corporations from being able to force themselves to let themselves frack on your land, for instance. And yet, the Greens, I've gone through their platform, I've listened to what they've had to say on the rare occasion they've said anything, and they express concern or like a philosophical objection, if you like, but they're not campaigning on it, not even close,
no.
And they could. So then you have to ask the question, why aren't the Greens campaigning on this?
Yeah. And you'd think it'd be right up their alley too.
Yeah.
You'd think that the Greens, you know what I mean? They wanted to, if the Greens had any shot at even trying to become a minority party, this would be it. This is a massive thing. But as you said, there are senators that are voicing concerns over this, but no one's campaigning on it. No one's actually taking action against this, and that's the problem, Lindsay.
Now you think of the hundreds of billions of dollars that are at stake for mining or energy companies, for pharmaceutical companies, for movie and video game companies, and all these companies who stand to benefit if they can subvert national sovereignty and use our courts against people. There's a lot of money at stake here, and anybody who knows anything about history and human nature knows that the people who are making that kind of money, their average life does not matter to them. Now, it seems pretty obvious to me that there must be a reason why the Greens aren't saying anything about this. The simple explanation would be because they're scared of backlash from the mainstream media, but the mainstream media has always been pretty harsh on the Greens, rightly or wrongly. So really, a new campaign against them, I can't see that being a particularly big threat. Right. So what else might have been threatened against them to stop them from campaigning against the TPP? I can think of one obvious thing, Lindsay. And now you think about this logically. If you're Senator Christine Milne, the leader of the Greens, and by the way, for our listeners at home, the Greens have something like 10% of the primary vote in elections. They've got maybe 6 or 8 or 10 senators in a 70-person Senate. They're a minor party in the true sense of the term, but they're about stable, and they have been at that size for 6 or so years now. If you're the leader of that party, Christine Milne, and you're on, $300,000 a year as a senator, I'm not sure, you get to mix with all of the elites of your city, and you're loved by the minority of people who like your party, you're probably leading a pretty good life. And if someone says to you, in implicit or explicit terms, that you can campaign on this issue, or on that issue, or this bunch of issues, and there's no problem, but this particular little issue, you might not want to make your own little toy over here, maybe you leave it alone. Because the people who are involved here, the money that's involved, is worth so much more than your political career or even your life. What do you think?
Yeah. There was and I can't recall the name now, but there was a Green senator sometime in the past who took money to take the family overseas and then made a decision against the public's interest and against what she said she was going to do, and nobody came out and called her, you're corrupt or whatever, but it was pretty obvious that was happening. So there is a precedent for this. I'd have to go and do the research to give you the names. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that, absolutely.
Yeah.
But then that wouldn't surprise me one bit.
But and ultimately it comes down to trying to find a way to restore the House of Representatives to what their name is, representatives of the people.
Yeah.
Every single electorate should have someone that represents that electorate and doesn't represent a party or represent an ideology of a majority.
Yeah.
It should be old mate from the country representing his people, this person from the rural regions representing this person, bringing the issues, and the people should have some sort of a smart device or something, or some sort of a way to know if their representative is voting against that. It shouldn't be that, but it's been designed as this paradigm so that the majority agenda gets supported. And people like, as we mentioned, the anti-terrorism laws, the couple of lone Labor MPs and everything that were in there opposing it, they could actually get their voices heard. And it just comes down again to control and agendas at hand, Johnno.
Yeah, and that's the point that I make to people. We know that before he became the President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush was the head of the CIA. Now, we know how extensive the CIA capabilities are today. We know how extensive ASIA, Mossad, and all of these other organisations. We know what they know. We know some of what they know anyway. We know some of what they're capable of getting. And you look at your typical politician, you look at your typical high-profile person in the media, you think about the information that these people have on them. And then you tell me who really runs the show.
Yeah.
So when people talk to me, Ethan, optimistically about reclaiming democracy or making representative democracy representative again, I love the idealism behind it. It seems to me that we're at the point now where our solution won't be Parliament as it currently stands, so long as a small group of people control the media, which controls people's minds, so long as a small group of people control what's taught at school, which controls people's minds. There's never going to be such thing as representative democracy, because the supposed voters, the supposed democracy, they're not there to be represented. They're there to be entertained, they're there to be distracted, and you and I could go out there door knocking right now about the TPP, and we could tell people everything that we've told them today. And I put to you that a lot of people, they want to go with the flow, and the flow is controlled by a small group of people who are in cahoots with the big beneficiaries of the TPP.
Yeah, no doubt, and I think you are right about that. I don't think, as we've just mentioned before, it's not going to be solved through the Parliament. It's up to us. It's up to people to build a community and try to do something this way, and to spread alternative information to like-minded thinkers through podcasts and through alternative media. It's the only viable solution, because you can't. There's no way that you can tackle it head on, in my estimation.
No, I agree. I just remember Pauline Hanson. They had about 20% of the population were behind her, and the media just did a job on it. And the ABC in particular, just did an absolute job on her, because they don't want anybody else but those they can control.
I'm glad you bring Pauline Hanson up. I'm planning to do a feature on her in the next episode or the episode after that. A very important part of Australian history that so few people seem to remember. Just really quickly, though, for the listeners at home, Lindsay, am I right in saying, because you were in Queensland at the time, I was just a young kid in Victoria, but at the time, in the seat of Oxley, at the state election in 1998, she won something like 2/3 of the primary vote, which the modern major party politician can only dream of 2/3 of the primary vote. Yeah. That's what she won. She was very popular. She formed the One Nation Party, and that had a lot of support. And then she was attacked relentlessly by the media. There was a fund put together called the Australians for Honest Politics Trust, or something like this. Yeah. And who were the people who put it together? A member of Uncle Rupert's News Corp, and our then Federal Health Minister, who is now our Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. And this fund was used to get her imprisoned. Pauline Hanson spent a year in prison, supposedly for electoral fraud. She was acquitted, or whatever they call it when you're let out of prison because you weren't guilty, after a year. She spent a year in prison, a political prisoner, in this country, and her only real crime was appealing to a whole bunch of nationalists in Australia, because there are still many out there. Yeah. And that's why there are so many votes in this TPP. It undermines national sovereignty, and if people like Pauline Hanson hadn't been crushed when they had the chance to crush her, she'd be winning elections by fighting against this. Yeah. And that's exactly why she was a political prisoner in this country. I hear people talk about Ukraine and how corrupt they are and all this nonsense. You want to talk about corruption? Let's look at relatively recent Australian history. Yeah. You fight the system and they'll try and take you down or imprison you. Or if you're smart enough to not get in prison, like Senator Christine Milne, maybe they make you an offer you're never going to refuse.
Yeah, I agree. And coming back to your corruption, I think I mentioned that before. I've come across a few things in my personal, the area around me, that Australia is just absolutely rotten to the core, and particularly the people in high places. And it comes back to pedophilia and a whole range of other things. So when you were talking before about how they control them over money, it's not just that. It's all this other stuff as well.
No, definitely, yeah.
Don't you worry. I want to also do a feature piece on the things that came out of the investigation into the British parliamentarians and the dodgy things that were going on there. And there's very good reason to believe that some of the things that happened, I mean, this is not to defend anyone who engages in those practices, but there's good reason to think that those things were used as a way of control.
Oh, I'm sure they were.
And if it can happen in England, why can't it happen here? So don't worry, listeners, keep tuning in, and I'll have a feature. Lindsay and I can work on that one together. A feature on the politicians in London who were caught involved in some really shady dealings, and people at the top were controlling them. No question about it.
I'll just focus on my brilliant segues. I'll take it back to
which I'll take as a good cue. We've only